got to watch it 3 times. So
Cool. Okay, so it's being recorded. It's just going to be me jamming out on like some validations, but we can get started and talk about things. So first off, I'll share my screen, and we'll go from there. Great. Cool. Loop. 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 Great. So I have right here our pod number 2 Rails app. It doesn't have any validations in it currently. If you remember, we were doing vegetables, right? And we had this schema. We had name, plant date, color, and size. We can change that up for this if we want to. But basically, like, right now, if I were to go to Rails console, I can do this. And it works, right? So I'm going to do like, first I'm going to like make sure. Is this how I can do this? No. I'm going to do vegetable.select veggie. I'm just getting rid of clearing up my database. Cool. We have fun here. I definitely could be way better at this. Great. But right now, I want to make it so that any veggie we enter in our database exists. And you'll remember that we've gone through a couple of issues that happen when we don't have proper validations. Like, there have been times when in class, I have embarrassed myself by being like I vaguely remember at one point we had like a rating from 1 to 10, and then we had an emoji that would be multiplied by that many times. And then when I like did like times rating and I had accidentally entered nil, it crashed everything. So that's the kind of point of validations, is to make sure that you like A, people aren't entering like dumb data into your app, and B, that you have the right data so that nothing in your app crashes, right? And I'll talk about those more. But first off, let's just start building out some validations, right? So, oops, here we go. Can anyone tell me how I can solve the problem of never having data in like a name in my app that's nil?
Could validate for presence.
Validate for presence? Cool. Do you remember how to type that one out?
Validates.
That's with an S?
Yes. And then name, or I don't know, whatever the attribute is called. Is it name? Yeah, name. And then presence, colon, true.
Cool. Let's take a look.
I think.
Let me exit that first. Cool. So currently that ID is still nil now, right? And we can actually take a look at it. So I'm going to do this again, but I'm going to be like veggie, right? Now, does anyone know how I can get and see why it failed?
Do veggie.errors.
Yeah. Active record has this errors thing, right? That like we can add to our models, where it'll just like basically, I'll show you like how this works a lot tomorrow, but we can call errors full messages, and it will tell us what the errors are. And this is something that becomes really important. Also let me see if I can get like a light on my face so it doesn't look like I'm Dr. Claw in the Inspector Gadget films or TV shows or whatever. Here we go. Boom time. That's the worst. But so basically, when validations usually happen before updating a database, right? Like basically, before something is saved into a database, it runs your validations on them and see if they work. So first, if I do this, right? Am I going to see errors here on this veggie? I didn't create it with a name. But I also didn't create it. I just said veggie equals vegetable.name. And you'll see it doesn't have any errors. Yep. So errors are like given to it when we try to do something in the database, and that's when it runs those validations. And we can specify, like if we want to get really fancy, we can be like, hey, only run this validation on create. But that's something to talk through, to talk through if we need it rather than like all the time. But when we create it, it suddenly starts tacking on errors to it. So now dot errors dot full messages, you're seeing it creates an array of errors that we can then find out stuff about, right? And they're really powerful too. You can like the validates, if you like look into the documentation, there's a bunch of stuff you can do. Like instead of just saying present's true, like presence will do like a weird thing where it assumes that I'm like writing true if I don't give it anything. And I can be like, or you could even be like, I think it's percent value, you monster, or percent attribute. And we can take a look right here. Really getting ambitious here with the error messages. So now it says name, you forgot a name, you monster. It automatically appends, when you call full messages, it automatically appends the attribute to the front of it. But you can throw a lot of things in here. You could be like, if oh, this is ambitious. I'm definitely gonna break it now. Let's take a look. And then eventually we can like going to walk that one back until we look at the docs, because eventually looking at the docs is how you're going to like start doing these. But validates is one way we can do a validation. There's, I think 4 are the ones that is my count, right? You can also call validate, validate with, and validates each. And these last 2 are going to be a little bit tricky. I might breeze through them when we're discussing them in lecture. They allow us to create a validation class, to basically like create a separate class in our folders for validations, that then we can abstract and we can use in multiple classes. Validate, however, is really helpful for allowing us to write custom validations, right? So instead of validates name, I can write a validate method that just goes validate swag, right? And that's like, now I can do something right here where I can have like a private method called def swag. And I can say name dot include swag, right? And I can do like unless name.include swag, I believe we would write something like, let's go to the documentation here just to make sure that, like, just so that I can start showing it to you. Like, there's the parts of the documentation you need are all of them, but specifically, there's like the basic validation helpers, which are like really friendly and really useful for when you want to like do something basic, like name, presence, true. And there's like all these things you can add things to. And then there's like conditionals that are helpful. But when you go to performing custom validations, there's two things. Custom validations, which is the one I was talking about, custom validators, which was the thing I was talking about earlier, where you create a class that validates. But oftentimes, that's a little overkill for the apps that students are building. If you scroll down to custom method, you can take a look, and they say, hey, I'm going to define two additional like methods that are in my class that I'm then going to use, right? And the way I do that is like, I have like, unless the name includes swag, I can be like errors.add. And then I take in the symbol of like the attribute I want to talk about, right? And then I'm going to be like, include the word swag, right? And let's take a look to see what that does right here. So I'm only validating for swag, right? For this like new thing called swag. And now if I were to be like vegetable.create, I think I'll get a different error, which is going to be a mess, because if I just do this, I think then I'm going to get like nil doesn't have a dot include method. So that's something I would have to solve for. So I would have to write something like name and. And I can talk about that code in a second. Or actually, I'll talk about that right now. What I'm saying right there is I'm doing a, let's get this out of the way real quick. Let's close all of these messy tabs. And is like, is often used for like doing like, if these two things are true, and it's used for conditional statements, right? And the useful thing about them is that if the first one fails, it's just going to return false rather than reading the rest of the code. It won't even read this section if you have like an and right here and this part is false. So that's often useful for like when you get to React, like this is called short circuiting. If you use this to return something directly, so I could be like, I could like have a modified name method where I can be like, I could be like real name, and I can like say like, hey, it's return unless name. I'm actually going to get totally in my head here about how I'm going to do this. I think this is actually a terrible example right here. I'm going to like walk that one back. But basically, you can use this to like be like, hey, don't show anything unless there's like a name here. So like that becomes really helpful in React, where you're like, hey, should I put out this HTML element? Let's only put out this HTML element if it has a name. And then like we can do something to that. But this is probably the best way. I'll be like, hey, this is going to return false, and then it'll do nothing. But like then we can have like this, right? And I realized that I just explained them the worst possible way because I went into a lecture on short circuiting before prepping it. But take a look right here, and you'll be like, cool. This seems like this is how I'm going to create this error. Does everyone see what I'm doing right here? My code speaks better than I do right now. Cool. Now, if I get this, This is going to return false. Whoops. This is going to return false regardless of, thank you. This is going to return false if there's no name or if name doesn't include swag, right? So I'm getting this error right here. And now if I do like cheese, that's first off not a vegetable. And it's going to give me a fail again. But now if I do a vegetable that I'm going to call swag potatoes, right? We've got no errors, right? This is a custom validation, and the easiest way to do it is just with this validate, this custom method, right? So at this point, the difference between validates gives you any of Rails's custom, or any of Rails's built-in validators. And you can do a lot with those. Like, you can do an absurd amount with those. Eventually, though, you might have a situation where you're like, hey, can I check to make sure that this is a real like email address? And Rails will probably have something for that, honestly. But like, be like, this is a real Hotmail email address because I only want people who are over a certain age, and suddenly like just having a yes or no check marks on 21 doesn't work anymore. So like, but if someone has like a Hotmail address that's pretty authentic, like you really have to be at least 30 for that. So like that might be a time for a custom validator that Rails doesn't have. And that's where we do validate swag. The times when you'll use these are when you want multiple classes to share the same validator. For example, if you're like creating two different models in your database and you want them both to be pretty swag, that might be a situation where you'd create a swag validator that just validates each to check to see if there's swag and if like there's swag in them, depending on like which attribute and value we pass in. My recommendation is like, I can go over that briefly, but usually that comes when you're in production and suddenly you're like, oh, I'm going to check out the documentation. And usually by the time you're in production, you're pretty good at reading that documentation. So it's not something necessarily to memorize now. I know that we walk you through how to do validates with. I think that's a thing that you can safely store in the like, know that it exists rather than know how to do it like when asked. And because I recorded this, you can take that to the bank. You can take that to your code challenge and be like, hey, look, Nicky said this. And you will hopefully then get a pass. Usually this, like the validates and validate are all you need. Does that make sense to everyone?
So is this considered back end or front back end? Okay.
Very back end because it's dealing with our database. And usually like, so in your front end, right, there's nothing to say, hey, like there's nothing on my view that says, whoa, you're about to hit enter here and you don't have the word swag, right? Like that's going to be front end validations. So we can show one of those, right? I'm going to like do something, instead of getting rid of this validate swag, which doesn't really work for a vegetable app. We're going to instead do, we're going to do validates, and then we've got size, inclusion. Let's take a look. There's two ways that we can do. We can do like greater than or less than. So one is numericality, which is something that a lot of people do. And then you can have like things like you can have like additional sets, right? Like you could be like, hey, numericality should have only integers, right? And that might be useful. You could also, but like there's also this like greater than or equal to, right? Which is super helpful. There's a few other things. Like you'll see like, hey, it doesn't allow nil, but you can make it allow nil. But inclusion is a more like is a more broad way of being like, hey, it should be in one of these, right? So I can say this %W means like make an array out of these symbols. Like if you see that around, just know like they're just making an array there. And I can do something like, once again, speaking before testing my code. I've definitely done this before, like today. Let's take a look to see what happens here. In this case, I'm passing it a range and the numbers between 1 and 10. And now I can be like, hey, vegetables.name, swag, size. And I can be like 9, or I'll be like 11. Let's test out the false case first. Cool. Now it doesn't break. Did I save? There. Come on. I'm getting this error. Oh, right. It didn't save. Yep. Cool. Great. Yeah. No. So this works. It says in 1 to 10. This is not in 1 to 10. We've got this awful custom, like way of this awful custom message that I might want to change. Let's take a look. So we can be like, hey. And you'll see that the documentation just like already predicted what I was about to do and was like, here's how you write that code for you, because Rails documentation is amazing. You can be like, cool. Yeah?
So Nikki, the
Yeah.
percent with the curly brackets value, that's the attribute that we're validating, correct?
Yeah, so it's the value that they passed in. Let me actually just show you this in the. Ooh, this is definitely here somewhere.
Does it need the curly bracket?
Basically, there's 3 that you can use, right? There's percent value, which gives you the value that they passed in. So you'll notice in this case it was 11, is not between 1 and 10. There's attribute, which will give you like size is not between like 1 and 10, right? If I did attribute here, it'll give me the word size. And
when you search the document, you should put %, and then bracket, and then value inside of there, and it should pop up.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't think you would put in the curly brackets.
Oh, gotcha. Thank you. Value, attribute, and model. Whoops, no, stop that. Great. Didn't want spoiler alerts for what your future lectures are going to be. Yes, so value, attribute, and model. And so cool. Great. So now we have a very specific one that will tell me a whole lot and use all three of those, right? Because we eventually might want to have animals be out of 100 because animals can get way bigger than vegetables. So I might be totally wrong on that. Kyle will have stronger opinions. But at this point, right, there's a whole lot we can do with just message and like inclusion alone, right? We just made something really custom with just the Rails like built-in stuff here. So at this point, do we have any questions about what we've done so far? I realize that like we just went straight into validations rather than talking about how they work, like what they are. I'm going to talk more tomorrow, like during lecture about like, hey, this is like what validations are. And I'm going to like do this as an introduction. But when we do the labs, like trying out different validations is really like the way you get good. And right now, the next thing I want to remind everyone is that you can add multiple things here. I don't just have to like, I don't just have to have like a lot of times I'll see students do this. And then you would have like, color. And you'll have like size. I'm not going to add a date validation because at this point we could, but I don't want to like do that while we're doing other things because then I'll have to like write date.today every single time I write something. But we could eventually do a validation to make sure that they're not adding something into the future, and I'm sure that will be like a cool way to cap off this pod. But instead of doing this, remember that I can just do color. And I can just add as many as I want because Ruby is super friendly. And we'll test that. Cool. What's going on with veggie.errors to full messages? You forgot to name your monster. You forgot to color your monster. Size 11 is not between 1 and 10. Vegetable cannot have a size bigger than 10. That is reserved for animals, right? And right now, this is just printing to our console when I ask it about it in the bybug. But we can then, and that's the next portion of this, and that's going to be what I cover off a lot more in the lectures, we can then pass these errors directly on to our user. Let's see what else. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, can we take a moment to go back to when you asked us if we have any more questions?
Yeah.
Okay, I have a question. When you do the value is not like when you like interpolate value in, can you like downcase that? Because it looks kind of funny having a capital word in the middle of your. Is that a thing or?
I don't know. I want to find out too. Yeah? That's how we do a downcase, right? Batman.
Technically.
Cool. Let's try this. Right. We were just okay. So at this point, it passed in the word value. So my guess is that that's not going to work.
So can you just put a dot down case on value inside of its brackets instead of putting an interpolation?
Because this is a string.
Like on the inside.
Let's take a look.
I think that's really cool. It just looks a little bit dumb.
Yeah. No, it's still giving us size dot is value dot down case, right? And that's because it's like doing some string stuff right here rather than just doing rather than just running Ruby. This is probably is their domain specific language for doing weird string stuff rather than like any sort of Ruby interpolation. Usually I would be if I were like actually using this feature, I'd be like,
Okay.
and that would save me the time like to write out a custom validation. But if I needed to, right here, if I could like write a def insulting presence validator, right? And I could be like, unless, and this is one I think I would have to, there might be a way to like pass in each attribute. We can take a look in the document. We could be like, and then we can like do our string interpolation, right? And then we'd have to like actually write it out. So I don't think that's even helpful. Let's take a look, see right here to see how we can do that's dark. It's using a specific gem. Let's take a look. Or let's not. Let's just Google it and find out what's going on. International and localization gem for strings. Okay. But I'm going to switch down to custom. I'm not sure you can like pass in which method is being validated. I think you have to be more explicit here. If you were doing like validate each, this would actually be a really good time to use a validate each. If you want to like have this be your message for everything, but like make sure it's downcase and stuff like that. Validate each will like pass in the record, the attribute, and the value, right? And then you can be like, hey, unless the value has something going on, give this an attribute of this with this like with this message, right? Or you could do something like a little bit more crazy. At this point, though, you might be getting a little bit too fancy with the spices, like most time you're coding, but know that this exists. Additional questions? Or did I answer that one? I realized that like the answer is just a disappointing no, we can't do that.
No, you did answer it because I saw in the docs while you were scrolling through that they were using it in the middle of a sentence.
Mm-hmm.
And it looks like they have a workaround for it. So I'll just look at the docs.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah, it was like that gem you Googled. It's up further up. But they were using like the word model in the middle of their error message.
Okay, so this is mentioned once.
Yeah, so like right there where it says attribute and model also available. So I'm wondering if they're able to with that gem that you were Googling.
It seems like you can call object.name, which is crazy. Oh. This looks a little wild. we can play around with this a lot if we want to. It might take like 10 minutes of us figuring out how this works, but it does seem like you can write a little proc, which is just like a piece of code, right? That will do some string interpolating for us. Let's try it.
I really did not mean to send us down a rabbit hole.
We don't have to if we want to do other things, but
I have a question. Is there a way to get rid of validations? I know you're like, why would you want to do that? But I'm practicing building Rails apps, and I'm doing belongs to a many, has many. And I noticed that sometimes I just want to create, let's say, a list or something, but because I have the has many, it has another ID. So I have to input an ID. I don't know if this makes any sense to you, but in order for me to create something.
oh, so
So
you're saying that basically you can't save it without an ID, like for the association?
yes, is
Yeah,
there a
there's
way to avoid that?
there is a better way to do that than with validations. Uh, I might save this one for
Another day?
the associations conversation, but there is a way to bypass that.
Okay.
And it's going to be in this thing right here.
Okay.
But you can always write save, validate, false. They are right. This technique should be used with caution. This is a useful thing whenever you see it in the Rails documentation. But you can always write like, let's say, like superhero.new spider squirrel girl. And then like I'd imagine like you'd have like a different like nemesis ID, right? Be like the enemy. And Squirrel Girl doesn't really have nemesis because she makes friends with everyone. So you would be like nil, right? And this isn't something that's going to work. But then you'd be like dot save, and then you could write like validate false. And I think that will skip the association portion of your database.
Okay.
It's
Just for
bad
practice,
though.
I was wondering how. So
Yeah.
that's helpful.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Totally. There is a way to like say like, hey, you can skip this, and it's going to be in here somewhere, but I'm forgetting where. I will include that in the lecture though. Cool.
Yes, thank you.
Are there any other questions about validations? Anything that you all found weird?
For some reason, it seemed way harder doing it in the labs. Not harder, but like just less intuitive doing it through the labs than watching you do it. I don't know if that's because, I don't know. So is there a specific reason? Is there something that the labs are doing that's like harder, or doing it a different way than you're showing us?
Maybe. It's also that when I'm coding along, I've written a lot of validations, so like the small weird things of syntax are things that like I'm just used to, so I didn't like try 12 things and have them fail. The labs are meant to make you practice until like you get it, but we could go to the labs and take a look.
That's helpful for anyone else. I just feel like I did worse going through the labs. Like I felt less confident about validations.
I did too. I think it was just more because there's like logic behind the validations of what you were trying to make happen. Like, can I just call presence, or do I need to use inclusion or the varied other lists of stuff? But yeah, I'm definitely struggling all of a sudden. So
Yeah, these are also tough, right? Like, these are tough validations to write. But we can, if you want to talk about any validation that you did, or like how you went about doing that, we can always like compare and see how everyone else did it.
Definitely blocked it from memory, so
Cool.
probably not.
No, I remember like when I was a student, I went through these and I was just like, I definitely struggled with like the last 3 of these. Yeah. But now you know what a percent W is, so you can always do like percent W fiction, comma nonfiction, which is right here in this. In this. Ah, I just went away from it. You'd be like, hey, percent W, fiction, nonfiction. Or you could just write it as an array like a normal person. Do you have other questions that we want to dig into?
Related to one of the labs, there was one that used a scope and a percent I. What is the percent I?
Ooh, I don't know. Let me take a look. Do you know which one?
It was the CRUD with Validations lab, and that was the solution that they provided for it.
Blue. Wow, I forked this back in January, in February of 2019. Cool. So they used
I didn't even see that.
Yeah, I didn't solve it that way, but I didn't know what they were doing really with the way they solved it.
yeah, interesting. Oh. That's crazy. Take a look. Cool. So that's a tool for uniqueness, right? To say like, hey, take a look to see if there's anything else in our database that has this, like, in this case, that has like that's crazy powerful. And also a little bit too fancy with the spices for, I think, the solution branch, which I will look into. Because there's not like it will create a hash from an array of try it on IRB. First off, I think it's silly that they have that. Is this how they write it?
Huh.
Okay, so they're just creating an array of symbols, right? And they're saying, hey, check to make sure. So they're passing in, this is annoying. Basically, imagining that I'm creating a song that is the spin, like Two Princes by the Spin Doctors, right? I'm creating Two Princes by the Spin Doctors off their album Pocket Full of Kryptonite in 1993. Right? At that point, like I'm adding in like I'm adding in this validation that then says like, hey, take a look at the title, and then use the uniqueness with the scope of like this array that I'm creating, right? Where you're just going to pass in like 1993 and the spin doctors, right? And then what it's going to do is it's going to have this useful little array to run through the database with. And it's going to like create that array with each different one. And then it's going to like check to make sure that that array doesn't match any of these like new created arrays that happen in the database. I think it's way too complicated to include in the solution branch. And I think that's like always the problem with the solution branches. Like there's always like someone who's like, okay, I'm really going to stunt on these students here. But this %i is just short for, hey, turn these into symbols and then run it. And I think the code would still work if you like just gave it an array of symbols. When it comes to scope, though, you can use to specify one or more attributes that are used to limit the uniqueness check, right?
On that one, I think I just used scope of like right here, like, yeah, scope of the release year. I think that's how I solved that one.
Yeah.
I
And
didn't
I think
do
there's just something
thingy.
Mm-hmm. There's checks the release year and the artist name, right? So I guess like if Talk Talk re-released It's My Life the same year that Gwen Stefani released her cover of It's My Life.
Yes, they would both be allowed.
Yes, and this one doesn't allow that.
I see.
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
It's full of them today. So when I was doing the date.today.year and I used carets instead of the actual like method of like less than or equal to or whatever, it kept giving me an error and I had to do like a wacky workaround that I don't remember. But is there a reason why it wouldn't let you use like characters as opposed to like a whole written thing?
So you're saying like
yeah, so like when I did that in a custom method, it kept giving me an error. Like I wrote a custom method, and so if you go back to the learn page, so the solution page, sorry. So when I did the song on like line 12 and 13, where it validates the song less than or equal to the date dot. So when I use the carets, it just like kept erroring out. Is there a reason why we wouldn't be able to like shorthand that or?
Yeah, numericality, let me just make sure that I'm right here. Numericality doesn't accept the carets because once you're writing inside this, inside like these brackets, you're suddenly writing in their domain specific language. So like numericality specifically expects the words greater than or equal to rather than like a greater than or equal to sign. So once you're writing in these brackets, that works. You could still write a custom validator.
I was doing like, a custom method.
Oh.
Validator,
okay.
But a custom method, and it was still giving me an error.
Cool. I kind of want to see that because I think that should work. And you had validate instead of validates?
Yes.
Cool. Let's write, we do actually have let's validate let's do, I think it's plant date. Cool. Plant date. Or wait, we're not doing that. We're doing validate plant date is not in the future.
That's what my solution looked like.
And it worked?
I passed the test, so
Weird. Meg, you remember this though, right?
let me
Plant
pull it up.
or vegetable.create. I should hash these out if we're testing this. First, let's try this. Cool, that works. Now I do date.tomorrow, right? Great. And now I get this error. Yeah, so the less than or equal to totally works as a private as a custom method. But I would want to see that error. It's possible that like something else went wrong.
Probably.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't do errors.add, will it give you an error? Like, do you have to have an error?
No, I mean you can always let's test this out. So you're saying will it fail anyways? It won't fail if I don't have an error. It's like puts you are a bad person, right? Let's try that. You will see that if I do this, it works, but I get this you are a bad person message, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is the worst way to go about like putting a like you are a bad person. Like I could probably instead do like a before save, right? And just let people know that they're a bad person. But this wouldn't fail. Like it's still committed into my database. Whoops. I didn't just live share, did I? Okay, let's stop that. And try this again. And now like it'll still say you are a bad person, but it won't be called a validator. This is the best practice way to shame people in the console. Like use a before save rather than like use a validator. That should really just like there should be an error somewhere in there. But yeah, you need like to have some errors be pushed in because basically the way validations work is it puts a bunch of things in errors, right? And then like the last thing that Rails does before it puts something in the database is it goes, hey, do you have any errors? If so, get out of here. So yeah. But like you don't have to do like errors.add. You can also do like errors.push. You can do errors shovel in because it's Ruby. So like they want to allow you to write any other programming language in Ruby and still be pretty much okay. But yeah. Cool. Any final questions before we finish this? I wonder if actually I'm now curious if you can use before save instead of validate, which would be bad. Don't do this. But let's test this out. No, it seems like before save will still allow me to. Let's take a look right with what I just did. How come that works? I guess before save happens after validations do.
Well, wouldn't it have to like validate then save?
Yeah, that makes sense. So it totally passes the validations, gets into our database, and then we had an error. So definitely don't do this. But we just learned a cool thing about Ruby.
Okay, so I looked
Now,
at my solution and I think we ended up going with like a completely like divergent path for that custom error.
oh, interesting.
Yeah.
What was the divergent path?
I did like if released equals true and released underscore year dot nil error add can't be empty.
Cool. Yeah, that seems like it makes sense.
Yeah, that was after the whole arrow thing. So we just kind of figured out another way to do it.
Cool. Right. Well, if there's any final questions, glad to field them, but I will let you go. Thanks for joining.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.